Hello, everybody. Hey, how about a cocktail? How about an exotic cocktail? How about a Mai Tai or a zombie? Do you know what I'm talking about? Hi, I am DeSoto Brown. You are watching my program here on ThinkTech Hawaii. And my program is called How Did We Get Here? And that consists of small stories about aspects of Hawaiian history. Well, an exotic cocktail. Let me tell you about what those are, and let me tell you about the two men who invented them. And let me tell you also how they came to be associated with the Hawaiian Islands, with Hawaiian culture, even though they don't have anything whatsoever to do with them. What you're looking at right here is an exotic cocktail. And what makes that? Why different from a regular cocktail? Well, cocktails consist of a mixture of different liquids, meaning one or two types of alcoholic liquids, and then other types of flavorings. Cocktails had already existed for a long time, since at least the 1800s, by the time these were invented. But what makes something exotic? It usually is kind of theatrical. By that I mean, it's got stuff stuck in it that is not what you put in other types of cocktails. So in this particular case, you can see there's a big piece of pineapple there. There are some flowers stuck in there. You can clearly see that there are two different types of liquid here because they're separated, but from the top to the bottom. And also, the real cliche of the exotic cocktail, a small paper umbrella, which in those days were something that were made in Japan and exported just to be used for fun reasons. Also, an exotic cocktail differs in another important way, which I will tell you about in a second. But I also, again, want to tell you the two men that we're going to be looking at today in this program are known by their professional names of Don the Beachcomber and Trader Vic. Neither of these men had anything to do with the Pacific. Both of them were from the United States. They both, by chance, happened to start their careers at the same time in California in the 1930s. One in Northern California, Trader Vic was in Oakland, and the other in Southern California because Don the Beachcomber started in Hollywood. So here are illustrations of a bunch of exotic cocktails. This happens to be a Don the Beachcomber menu. And you'll notice that not only are these cocktails served in a variety of different glasses, at least in this particular illustration, one of them isn't even served in a glass at all. It's served in a green coconut that's been cut open. And you'll notice that they have a lot of stuff stuck in them. And you'll notice they also are known by a bunch of evocative names. So there's the Navy Grog, and there's the Cobra's Fang. They also were promoted very frequently by both men as being extremely potent. And in various cases, they would say that they wouldn't serve more than two of any particular cocktail to the same person because of how potent they were. The difference also with exotic cocktails is what they're made of. Most types of alcohol, first of all, alcohol comes from fermented plants, different fruits, different grains, whatever. And so the types of alcohols normally used in the United States came from plants that grow in colder, temperate zone climates. So, for example, whiskey comes from grain, corn, and those are crops that are grown in the temperate zone. And then gin comes from juniper berries. Well, juniper trees are conifers, they are evergreens, and they come from cold climates. But the exotic cocktails are based on rum. Rum is fermented from sugarcane, and sugarcane only grows in the tropics. Rum was invented and mostly produced originally, certainly in the 1800s, in the Caribbean islands, because of course they're warm, like the Hawaiian Islands are. And the Caribbean islands were where a lot of sugarcane was grown, as here in the Hawaiian Islands. And that's where rum comes from. So both Trader Vic and Don the Beachcomber used rums with various other types of flavorings, you might say, gave their cocktails funny names, and turned them into an entire industry. So here are the two men that are the subject of my program right now. On the left, you can see that's Don the Beachcomber. On the right, you can see an illustration that was used on a postcard that was mailed out for Trader Vic's restaurant in Honolulu. Now, both of these men began their businesses in the early 1930s, as I said, in California. And that occurred because prohibition had just ended. Prohibition was the prohibiting of the manufacturing and sale of alcohol in the United States. And prohibition came into effect in 1920, and it was because of an amendment to the Constitution. It wasn't a law, it's a constitutional amendment. And that meant it was very difficult to end it. But during that time period, the only alcohol that was for sale in the US was illegal. So a huge industry sprang up of which people created and sold and then created sort of underground speakeasy bars to sell alcohol. Probably Don the Beachcomber and possibly Trader Vic were both part of this underground speakeasy sales of alcohol during Prohibition. But then when it ended and alcohol became legal again, they both jumped right back in with being able to open a bar and a restaurant attached. So both of them independently came up with the idea of exotic cocktails based on rum. And both of them created restaurants which were kind of fantasy interiors, which were based on an idea of the South Seas. Not the real thing, but something which was very appealing to a lot of people. Both men also began to grow their businesses to open restaurants and bars in other locations. Both men, as it happened, opened a restaurant in Honolulu that, for different reasons, had no connection to the rest of their empires of restaurants and bars in other places, which I will explain. Each man also was famous for inventing one particular exotic cocktail. And the most famous exotic cocktail, which probably everybody knows, is the Mai Tai. This was the creation of Trader Vic. And the story is that in 1944, in his restaurant in California, he mixed up a cocktail, right? Because these men were always trying different things out. They were always trying out different mixtures. They were trying out different stuff. They were very careful to keep their cocktail recipes secret so that other people couldn't duplicate them exactly. Well, Trader Vic supposedly was mixing something up and he gave it to a customer who happened to be a woman named Carrie Guild. Carrie, although from Chicago, had lived in Tahiti in the 1920s and 30s. And she had picked up some Tahitian language while she was there. And he asked her, well, what do you think of this? And she responded by saying, Mai Tai, which is the Tahitian word for good. And you may be familiar that in the Hawaiian language, this same word exists, but with a slightly different pronunciation of Mai Kai. And that became the name of the cocktail. Obviously, the correct pronunciation was dropped and it was turned into something easier for Americans to say, quote, Mai Tai. But it also, the name Mai Tai was promoted as meaning magnificent, out of this world, tremendous, blah, blah, blah. It just means good, nothing more dramatic than that. And Don the Beachcomber's signature famous exotic cocktail was the zombie. And if you look at this illustration and you see the text underneath, it reads, created at Don the Beachcomber in Hollywood in 1934, often imitated, but never duplicated. So again, this was the way both of the men worked. They kept their cocktail secrets, their cocktail recipes very secret. Both of them, certainly Don, mixed things up on his own in bottles which he then labeled with numbers. And those numbered bottles with mixtures for certain cocktails were then placed at the bar for the bartenders to use. And the bartenders themselves didn't know exactly what was in those mixtures. Both men had a rivalry. They acknowledged the other guy, they acknowledged that the other guy had invented good cocktails, but they also then tried to belittle the other guy sometimes a little bit. And Don famously in the 1970s and into the 1980s claimed he had actually invented the Mai Tai and Trader Vic was copying him. I don't think that's true. And I have no idea why he started to say that. But nonetheless, there was a whole intrigue about the cocktails that these guys invented. So now let's talk about each of the men and the restaurants that they created here in Honolulu. First, we start with Trader Vic. He came here in 1940 to Honolulu. He looked around for a place to build the restaurant. He found a good site and he hooked up with another man named Granville Abbott, who was the money guy. Granville Abbott was the man who actually put up the money to build the first Trader Vic's restaurant in Honolulu. He is the man who ran it day to day, and Trader Vic went back to California. So this happened in December of 1940. Within a few months, Trader Vic came back to check on his restaurant, and there happened to be a business dispute. I won't get into the details of that, but Granville Abbott bought out Trader Vic. And then, although the restaurant retained the name and it used the graphics and it used the same cocktails and it used the entire concept, it had no connection to the other Trader Vic's restaurant that subsequently came up. So that was very different from all the other Trader Vic's you could go to, even in other countries. And this is obviously a drink coaster from that first Trader Vic's in Honolulu. And here's what it looked like. This is the Trader Vic's restaurant. It was located on Ward Avenue. And as you can see, the site that it's on has got a lot of mature trees, looks very tropical and nice. Already on this piece of property to the right of this building, up Mauka towards King Street, was already another similar building, which was a souvenir and curio store that was called the Coconut Hut. That had already been there since the 1920s. So the two buildings, although they were totally different businesses, looked very similar. And they had sort of a synergy of looking like a tropical paradise, which was excellent for business. Now, you will notice if you look carefully that there are palm trees sticking out of the roof of the Trader Vic's building. They were already on the site. The building was constructed around them. It was just a regular building, but they covered it with coconut thatch to make it look as though it was some Polynesian fantasy. And in front of the building, facing Ward Avenue, the signature object that everybody was familiar with was this gigantic anchor. And it was an actual anchor. It had been found in the sediment of San Francisco Bay in the 1930s when the Bay Bridge was being constructed across the bay between San Francisco and Oakland. And after it was found when they were dredging, it got put aside and then brought here to Honolulu to serve as this kind of iconic object, which, as you can see here on the cover of this menu, is part of the whole appeal of the restaurant or appearance of the restaurant. Trader Vic's, just like Don the Beachcomber, created a fantasy interior, which was filled with sometimes authentic artifacts from different Pacific cultures, sometimes Asian cultures, but also newly made objects that just looked old, that looked interesting, that looked like sort of cliches of what people thought Pacific Island artifacts would look like. And as part of that, they also had these trading licenses, certificates, which they gave out to people who were customers. And there are at least 5 different designs from the Trader Vic's restaurant here, which were given out to people as souvenirs. And people in those days kept paper souvenirs more than they do today. And women in particular kept scrapbooks of photographs, for example. So this could go on a scrapbook, and that's how a lot of them survived. So this is quote a trading license, and the whole idea here is that Trader Vic, the fantasy character, is on some tropical island in the Pacific, in the South Pacific, the South Seas, and he has a trading post where people, native people, bring in things to trade for other stuff. So that's why the interior of the restaurant has all this stuff that the natives have brought in. And if you were a customer, you get this trading license, and it says this license, the license to trade here certifies that name of person, in this case, Major West, has this day bought good food and drinks from Trader Vic's and is thereby entitled to full trading privilege until revoked. And it's signed and dated at the bottom, June 22nd, 1955. It's really hokey, but a lot of people responded very favorably to this and enjoyed the entire experience. And of course, today we're accustomed to the idea of theme restaurants that do the same thing. Well, these guys invented the entire concept of a theme restaurant. And Trader Vic really played up the fantasy that at the Trader Vic's trading post in its original location in an unnamed Pacific part of the South Pacific, was where not only the native people came, but particularly beautiful, topless Polynesian women. So there's a very strong sexual aspect to the Trader Vic's concept. And these two menus from the 1940s and 50s very clearly show you that. It would be unacceptable in the United States for a menu of a restaurant to show a Caucasian haole woman with no top, with her bare breasts exposed. But if it's a dark skinned woman, it's okay because that's the way they really dress in the Pacific. Well, in some places, yeah, but mostly not. You notice also that the Trader Vic character, which you see on the menu on the left from the original restaurant in Oakland, is a guy sitting in front of his trading post on top of casks of rum, because again, that's the source of all of the exotic cocktails. But sitting next to him is a completely nude Polynesian woman wearing only a little apron because he's so appealing to all of the native women that they just don't leave him alone. Well, we won't go any further into that, but that's a big part of the Trader Vic's concept. So what happened to that Trader Vic's? Well, as I said, it was on Ward Avenue. And today, if you are in Honolulu and I know what I'm talking about, it's on the Eva side of Ward Avenue across from Blaisdell Center, which is what's mainly we know in that area today. In the 1960s, Trader Vic's had changed hands twice. Two different new owners came along. And again, Trader Vic still had nothing to do with this. This was just this location being sold. And eventually it was bought by the Spence Cliff restaurant chain, which was a local chain of restaurants here in Hawaii, mostly on Oahu. And in 1970, or in the 60s, the late 60s, the lease on the property expired. And the new owner allowed Trader Vic's to continue to remain there for a while. But in 1970, Spence Cliff eventually closed down that location because by then the building was in very poor condition. And Spence Cliff moved Trader Vic's to a new building in the International Marketplace in Waikiki. And it remained there in business up to about 1990 when it closed down. The International Marketplace is now gone, but I'll get to that in a second. So there's no Trader Vic's here anymore, and there has not been for a long time. But it did obviously play its part in influencing people. And now let's talk about the other guy, Don the Beachcomber. Don the Beachcomber, when World War II began, had two different Don the Beachcomber's restaurants. He had been married in the 30s, but he and his wife had gotten divorced in 1940. He joined the army during World War II, 1941 to 1945, but his wife stayed back at home and she ran the restaurants. At the end of the war, 1945, Don the Beachcomber comes back home and his wife says, "Here is a agreement that I want you to sign." And the agreement said she was going to take control of the existing restaurants and he only would have permission to open another restaurant using his name in one of the territories of the United States. And at that time, the Hawaiian Islands were one of the territories. We weren't a state. So in 1946, Don came here to look for places to build his own Don the Beachcomber restaurant, which would have no connection to the other ones that were already in business in the USA. So he settled on a location in the middle of Waikiki, and here is a photograph of one of the three buildings of that first complex that he created of Don the Beachcombers. And of course, there were exotic cocktails, and of course, there was food. And by the way, both of these men served Southern Chinese food, Cantonese food, and also with some other Japanese and Indian elements for both of them. It had nothing to do with the Pacific. Remember, again, both of these guys are saying it's a Polynesian restaurant. No connection to Polynesia, a connection to Asia, but nothing to Polynesia. So, in any case, of the three buildings, the one that you see here at built at Don the Beachcombers was the curio store slash souvenir store. And this is the one, this is the building that faced onto Kalakaua Avenue. So it gives, again, this very rustic, very Polynesian look to a stretch of Kalakaua Avenue. And Don was very well known. Don the Beachcombers restaurant was very well known and very successful in this location. The downside of taking this location was that Don could only get a lease for 9 years because the lease on this property was going to expire. And the landowner, which was the Queen Emma Estate slash Queen's Hospital, was going to bring that lease to an end. But Don was a very smart man, and he didn't sit back and just wait for his lease to expire. He got two very wealthy investors involved who had come from different places in North America. I can't remember now which ones they were. And with them, he did this to the same site. So here's a photograph of what happened on that same location after the lease expired in 1956. This was the beginning of the international marketplace. And the international marketplace encompassed a lot more land than the Don the Beachcombers restaurant had. And again, it was meant to look exotic. It was meant to look like this Polynesian fantasy. It didn't look like anything real. But being right in the center of Waikiki, millions of people saw it, millions of people went to it. It was very successful. And it was pretty much the creation of Don the Beachcomber. He didn't put his money into it, but he worked with the architects, the architect that he hired originally, which is Pete Wimberly, to put together this Polynesian fantasy, again, in a very beautiful setting with a lot of mature trees and a lot of vegetation and foliage. And the Don the Beachcomber restaurant was located at the back of the original International Marketplace property, not right on the main drag as it had been before. Don did own another restaurant and bar right at the front of the property that people could walk into easily. But being at the back of the International Marketplace actually wasn't that good for business. And so in 1961, Don subleased this property, this building, to a business hui that included Duke Kahanamoku. And this Don the Beachcombers building became Duke Kahanamoku's restaurant and nightclub, which became very famous starting in 1964 for hosting the Don Ho show. And Don Ho was very much part of 1960s tourism in the Hawaiian Islands. Don was a very canny businessman and a very canny guy in creating, again, the fantasy that he wanted to show. So he said, look, I'm a beachcomber. So this picture that you see on the left is, look, this is just me wandering around on the beach looking for odds and ends because I'm just a guy who doesn't do a lot of business. Well, that wasn't true. This was a total fantasy. He was a very astute businessman. And he also created Similarly to Trader Vic's, the idea that not only were his restaurant where all these interesting objects were displayed, which they were, but also in a setting of a lot of lush tropical foliage and beautiful women. He didn't play it up as much as Trader Vic's did, but he did have shows, floor shows with hula dancers and particularly Tahitian dancers. So there were Polynesian shows at Don the Beachcombers, which again showed off young Polynesian women dressed and dancing in seductive manner. This is a big part of what both of these men's business were like. And also, in addition to the floor shows, in addition to the cocktails, in addition to the Cantonese food, Don staged a weekly luau, particularly in the 1950s, which was very popular. And there were two interesting aspects of this. One was that in order to come to the luau, to make it seem less like it was a massive thing done for hundreds of people at one time, which it was, you had to pick up a personal invitation. So you could make a reservation by phone, but then you had to come to the restaurant beforehand and pick up a handwritten invitation that said, I, Don the Beachcomber, am inviting you. Also, when you came to Don's Luau, it was required that you wear something Polynesian, meaning he was telling you you had to go out to a local store and buy locally made Hawaiian aloha wear to wear to his event. And that was for two reasons. One, to put people in the mood, because it was kind of like dressing up for a costume party, but also he was supporting other local businesses. And that was something he worked at very actively in particularly in the late 40s and early 50s to build up business in general in Waikiki for everybody who had a business in Waikiki. So what happened? Well, various things happened, but mainly starting in the 1960s, Waikiki began to grow explosively because tourism exploded in numbers. And that was because jet airplanes came into use starting in 1959. So Kalakaua Avenue became more and more congested, lots more vehicles, lots more pedestrians. Waikiki was turning into a city of its own. And you can see in this photograph from 1960 what I'm talking about. Even in 1960, Waikiki was pretty thriving and pretty bustling. So the basic thing that came to play in Don's case was that the international marketplace where he was located became more and more built up and more congested and more filled up with buildings and vendors and kiosks and push carts, etc. Finally, to the point where it was too run down to keep going. And so in 2013, the international marketplace closed, everything was bulldozed, and the entirely new international marketplace was constructed and opened in 2016. And that was the end of that original Don the Beachcombers fantasy. Now, both men passed away in the 1980s, and that ended their rivalry. And it also ended their personal connection to their businesses. And there still are Don the Beachcomber and Trader Vic's restaurants in existence today in different locations. But of course, there's very little connection to what they were originally. However, the exotic cocktail lives on. And the inventions of the cocktails that those guys created are still very much with us. So, in that respect, their legacy is already well established and it's probably not going to go away. People today still drink Mai Tais and they still drink zombies and they still drink this stuff and they expect to drink this stuff. So, while the restaurants may not be here anymore, there's no more Down the Beachcomber, there's no more Trader Vic's. Cocktails are still served abundantly. And that's the story of how they got started, which I bet you did not know. So, thanks for joining me. I'm DeSoto Brown. You just watched an episode of How Did We Get here on ThinkTech Hawaii. I hope that you'll be joining me again in the future for further historical stories like this. And until I see you again next time, Aloha.